Years before the American Revolution, and the states of America were still considered colonies of the British Empire, there were many American Indian tribes that lived side by side with colonials, and trade relations with them reigned supreme in both American and European economies. Indian trade was one of the greatest forms of economy in the early 18th century. By then, colonists and American Indians had grown up together for some 5 generations. Knowing how to get along with each other was a way of life. But of course, it wasn't always that simple or easy. There were many American Indian skirmishes and wars that took place in Pennsylvania and most other states. Indian kidnappings, village burnings, and pillaging. Well, for thousands of years before European colonization, this had been the tragic way of life. Weaker tribes gave in to the iron fists of stronger and politically savvier tribes. The Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois nation, for example, was a woodlands tribe who formed a confederacy of 6 different tribes who allied together to form a powerful governing body over much of the Northern Territory. These tribes mainly lived in New England and Canada, where the majority of Iroquois still live to this day. Well, when the French and British in particular began exploring the land, they traded goods and established relationships with as many of the American tribes as they could. Things the European settlers would trade were things like household goods and weapons. For these, the Indians would trade animal pelts. Among American animals that were hunted and skinned by woodland tribes were deer, buffalo, and of course, beaver. Beaver pelts in particular were sought out to make hats and other textiles. These furs and skins were highly desired in the European market for fashion. Well, after generations of doing this, by the 18th century, these trade relations with the Indians became a huge part of the American and European economy. It was the way of life. Well, the conundrum that arose, needless to say, was that many of these Indian tribes were age-old enemies with other established Indian tribes in the area. When the French became allied with the Shawnee, the Delaware, the French then, de facto, became enemies of those tribal enemies. These would be the Haudenosaunee, the Cherokee, and Catawba. Now, of course, it wasn't this simple. Neither the Europeans nor the Indians were complete fools. The Europeans had tried to ally with every tribe they met, and likewise the Indians tried to ally themselves with Europeans of various ethnicities. The French at first were allied with the Haudenosaunee, but internal strife and conflict caused the two parties to drift apart. The Haudenosaunee then became friends with the British. Every European power that became involved in America couldn't help but become involved in these tribal wars. There became intense competition on part of the Indians to be allied to all Europeans, and they would fight their enemies for supreme rights to trade with the Europeans. So too did the Europeans compete with each other to have Indian allies to trade with. So overall, the Europeans and Indians competed with each other to have rights to trade with each other. This is why, when the British became quite good at trading with Indians, they sold them more goods for a cheaper price. While the French got very angry and territorial. No way would the French let their age-old enemy, the British Empire, hone in on their good relation with the Indians. The French, after all, had arrived earlier than the British. And became well acquainted with the Indian tribes in the Canadian territories. What arose over time was a Cold War over business. A Cold War that sometimes became very heated. The important thing to remember is that the Indians became quite savvy customers, often playing the French and the British off each other to get what they wanted. The French allied themselves with Indian tribes up north from Canada, and the British made Indian alliances upward from the south. And their paths crossed in Pennsylvania, in an area called the Ohio Valley. One incident in particular, which is the focus of this video, sparked one of the many Indian and European wars that took place during this century. This one, however, turned into a global conflict that would change the world of modern history. It became the 7 Years' War, or as we call it, the French and Indian War. This one incident that started it all is known as the Jumonville Affair, and it involved none other than a very young George Washington. I studied American, British, and particularly French sources to get to the bottom of what exactly happened in the Jumonville Affair. To support this research, I visited the site as well. Early November in 1753, 20-year-old George Washington departs Winchester with, and I quote, baggage horses, for the journey he was about to take. He was commissioned and appointed by the Honorable Robert Dinwiddie, Esquire, Governor of Virginia. He was to meet their opponents, the French, in central Pennsylvania. The French and colonial British were arguing over rights to land and trade with the American Indian tribes of that area, and a young Washington was involved. Washington was ordered to talk to the French commandant, giving an order for them to leave the territory and let the British and their Indian allies keep trading there safely. Washington inherited this commission from the Virginia government after his older brother Lawrence had passed away quite suddenly from tuberculosis. He would have been the commanding officer in this case, but instead a young Washington took his place. Well, Washington followed his orders to talk with the French, and traveling through the woodlands there with several Indian guides and making alliances and friends along the way, he met with a very gentlemanly French officer named Captain Jacques Lagardeur in the Pennsylvania wilderness at the French Fort Le Boeuf. Now, this meeting was not an entire success, as the French captain politely refused the Virginia governor's message, which was asking the French to depart from the Ohio country. Despite this, Washington returned to Williamsburg, pleased that he had completed the mission. Washington followed his orders to the T, and, with success, this made him a sort of political figure on the frontier. Then, on May 23rd, in 1754, several months later, a warning was sent out by the Seneca chief Tannacreson, someone who was a staunch ally with the British. He was a shrewd man with a tragic past and an ambitious future. He was also called the Half-King by the British. Well, his warning was strategically sent to his young ally George Washington, who was then a young colonel. Washington was scouting the land with a group of Virginia volunteers on behalf of Governor Dinwiddie. Young Washington had made a friendly alliance with Tannacreson the previous year. The Half-King had even given Washington an Indian name, Conottocarius, meaning town destroyer, which, unbeknownst to Washington, was also the nickname to Washington's grandfather. The Half-King's warning came to Conottocarius, young Washington, while he was camping in the Pennsylvania wilderness, and it read, "An account of a French army to meet Major George Washington." Well, not only did Tannacreson emphasize a powerful army was on its way, but he mentioned by name how the French were personally after Washington and his men. And remember, Washington had himself convened with the French that previous year for political reasons, and it failed, with the French refusing to meet British demands. Well, Washington was once again caught in the crossfires. The half-king's warning continued. "Therefore, my brothers, I desire you to be aware of them." He claimed the French were designed to strike the first English they see 2 days since they marched. The message, though a bit unclear, was effective in alarming the 22-year-old colonel to a threat that the French were coming, and coming with military intent. Washington had previously never been in a battle or experienced warfare of any kind, and with no superior officer to turn to, he took to heart the urgency behind the message. The half-king continued his message further, stating that he and the rest of the chiefs will be with you in 5 days to council. The message finished with the loyal assurance that the half-king cared no more at present but to give my services to my brothers the English. This must have given Washington some reassurance, considering the opening of the half-king's message. Tanacreson had cleverly set himself up to be Washington's confidant and helper. As Washington likely knew, there was no equal on the battlefield to American Indians. So it must have seemed sensible that Washington would follow Tanacreson's advice. The half-king was offering guidance at a time when Washington otherwise was alone, and the young Virginian welcomed the half-king's leadership. With that, Tanacreson had set his plan in motion. Washington was likely filled with nervous excitement. He was an inherently brave young man, but the half-king's message still came as a bit of a shock. Fortunately for him, the half-king had a battle plan. Washington later recounted the beginning of the event as having detached with a party of 75 men to meet with 50 of the French. Washington met with Tanacreson and his men in the woods of Pennsylvania, and the two of them decided to take a portion of their troops to engage the French, who were out to threaten them. They traveled through the night. This column of some 50 to 70 men traveled single file through rainy wilderness. The next morning, the men discovered the French in a sheltered glen, hidden from the main trail. Both companies of Virginians and Iroquois, men under Washington and men under Tanacreson, formed a disposition to attack the French on all sides. Washington believed this group to be spies, and needed to be well positioned should the French initiate combat. So in the early morning hours, before the sun had even rose, the half-king and his men, with Washington and his men, quietly gathered around this group of Frenchmen. There were only some 30 Frenchmen in this group, so while the half-king's message was not a lie, it was surely embellished. A shot was then fired. Though it's debated from which side the shot came, the Frenchmen awoke, and the Englishmen became alarmed, forcing a battle to begin. The leading officer of this French force was a 33-year-old man named Joseph Coulon de Villiers, Sieur de Jumonville. The French were defeated in some 15 minutes. Afterwards, Jumonville read his summons directed to the British. He claimed to be no more than a peaceful messenger, merely ordered to deliver a warning. The summons contained a French order for all the British to vacate the area. The 35-year-old commander could not finish his message, however, before Tanacreson, this Iroquois Seneca half-king, stepped forward. Against European protocol pertaining to prisoners of war, he put an end to it all. He interrupted Jumonville in front of the mixed company of onlookers, where he then gave a statement before smashing Jumonville with a tomahawk. You see, Tanacreson's father had been killed by Iroquois warriors who attacked his Catawba village when he was a child. Some French allies of the Iroquois were with them in the attack. He and his mother were then taken as slaves by the Haudenosaunee, and that's how he spent his young life, eventually working his way up to become a chief. he split the Frenchman's skull in two. Eyewitnesses state that Washington's men had to restrain Tannegreason's men from killing the rest of the French soldiers, of which they scalped 9 before Washington could stop it. Washington then ordered the remaining French prisoners to be taken back to Williamsburg, where they would meet Governor Dinwiddie and be held as prisoners of war. The results of this skirmish were 10 Frenchmen killed, including Jumonville, and 1 wounded. Washington then took the remaining 21 Frenchmen as prisoners back to Williamsburg, with 2 having escaped, meaning there were only a total of approximately 34 Frenchmen in the whole party. Having realized this was far less than the Half-King had claimed, Washington then deduced, with the Half-King's help, that these men were indeed spies and the real army was not far off. Washington, undoubtedly shocked by the event he witnessed, still clung to what the Half-King had told him. Tannegreason warned Washington that Jumonville's men have bad hearts, and that this, Jumonville's summons, was a mere pretense. The Half-King claimed the French never designed to have come to us but in a hostile manner, and if we were so foolish as to let them go again, meaning Washington sparing their lives, that he, Tannegreason, would never assist us, the British, in taking another of them. What George Washington didn't know was that from the very beginning there was more to the story than Tannegreason was sharing. For starters, there was no French army, and no dire threat of war was coming to attack Washington at this time. Up to that moment, the Half-King had been determined to initiate British hostilities against the French. He hated the French, and a heated yet cold battle between European nations for rights to the Ohio Valley's resources was driving the Half-King mad, and the threats made against the tribe took him almost to boiling point. What happened next was George Washington, under the gun, signed a French document after being captured by French forces at Fort Necessity. The document claimed that he had killed Jumonville. Now, the document was in French, and Washington had a humble education, so he could not read or speak it. Only a poor translator is what Washington had, and it was a disaster. Jumonville, while possibly a spy, was indeed a peaceful messenger. By European law, killing him was an act of war. The French crown overseas could no longer ignore British threats. And these threats, along with the incident of Jumonville, set the scene for what would be called the French and Indian War, or as the rest of the world knew it, the 7 Years' War, which many scholars call today the First Worldwide War. So records indicate that this is potentially the spot where Jumonville was slain by the Half-King Tannegreason, while the poor young Washington was just forced to watch at the time. So This is a very solemn place, but also a very special place. Because as we know, George Washington, as the records point to, was pretty much set up as a young man. That started a big war between his people and the French, and of course the American Indians who were involved as well. So if this can sort of be the final resting place between that feud Washington had with the French, because as we know in the American Revolution, it's amazing how things work out. He ended up becoming a huge ally to the French, and the French ended up helping us gain our independence. So no one can say history isn't incredibly important to know.
Brethren, you came a great way to visit us, and many sorts of evils might have befallen you by the way, which might have been hurtful to your eyes and inward parts, for the woods are full of evil spirits. We give you this string of wampum to clear up your eyes and mind, and remove all the bitterness of your spirit, that you may hear us speak in good cheer.
I think we all recognize this chap.
French forced their way onto our land, bullying us to trade with them and forming alliances with our enemies. This made war inevitable. I warned them that I would strike back, and I am true to my word. Colonel Washington was just a tool for us to drive off the French.